Hello! Here's the promised video going through all the crappy arguments landlords and their bootlickers use to justify their existence. I've spoken about the issues around the idea of landlordism in a previous video you can watch here. Hilariously, when doing a bit of research to find the absolutely strongest arguments landlords have, you come across insane takes like, I have to provide access for the disabled, and if I, from my eternal benevolence, didn't provide housing, the homeless would proliferate. Proliferate, I say! Despite conveniently forgetting that eviction is one of the largest reasons for homelessness, and the fact that to these people, the possibility is either be homeless or be a tenant. Absolutely no room to entertain the possibility of people owning the homes they live in, if only we lived in a sane world where regular people aren't priced out by investment firms, or, better yet, housing is socialized. Furthermore, you come across stuff like this in which, when enumerating all the things landlords do, over half the points are have money, and the other half being spend the tenant's money. By the way, the guy that posted this is some business bro type trying to shill his books on flipping houses, and has some other gems such as this to say. There is no law stopping them, meaning the poors, from buying houses and renting them out for whatever price they think is fair, or even for free. Yes, this is the caliber of people we're dealing with. Usual caveats, this concerns massive corporate landlords, not your grandparents who own one property for their retirement or whatever, blah blah, you know the deal. Anyways, let's jump right into it. But landlords are doing a social good by providing housing. The most common argument you'll come across, in my opinion. Their logic goes that without their generosity in allowing you to rent, homelessness would proliferate as landlords, apparently, buy property in order to provide the poor somewhere to stay for an affordable rate. Where would we be without such philanthropes? And I thought they were in it for the money. Silly me. Joking aside, this delusion is part of that trash can of ideology we always hear about. In reality, landlords in, for example, the UK have prevented 2.2 million families from homeownership in 2018 alone. I've seen a silly comparison that they do a lot that goes like this. Why would providing housing and charging for it be any more evil than a farmer growing food and selling it, a baker charging for the bread he baked, or any other commerce for profit? Well, in those examples, the baker or farmer are actually, working. They're providing a tangible good. They're not renting the bread or vegetables to you while they own them. Once you pay, you own them and can do whatever you like with them. Landlords own housing and expect to profit indefinitely from something they most likely inherited the money for, if not the property itself. Furthermore, landlords don't provide housing. They own housing. Big difference. Not only this, but rather than providing housing, they play an active role in preventing people from becoming homeowners themselves. For example, in the UK, roughly half of all people born between 1981 and 2000 will be renting well into middle age, and a third as retirees. Furthermore, the number of private tenants between the ages of 35 and 54 have already nearly doubled over the last decade. The figures aren't better for the US, by the way, where 12% plan on renting forever, and a further 37% want to avoid, quote, the pains of home ownership, such as furniture, monthly fees, such as property tax and homeowners insurance, and repairs that can tack on unexpected expenses. Basically meaning they wouldn't be able to afford the stuff necessary for the house, even if they could afford the house itself in the first place. That's not a preference to rent, but a sad admission as to how horrible the economic situation of most Americans is. This doesn't even touch on the reproduction of poverty and social inequality as a result of landlordism. To quote the Greater Manchester Housing Action I quoted in the previous video, picture a renter who has lived in their home for 30 years. Over this time, they will pay rent each month at a rate their landlord calculates is necessary to cover the landlord's mortgage payments, deposit, stamp duty, etc., the cost of keeping the property in a good state of repair and fit for human habitation, the landlord's profit, meaning the amount on top of the cost of supplying the property that makes the arrangement worthwhile to the landlord. After 25 years, the renter has paid off their landlord's mortgage. Of course, their rent is not reduced to reflect this landmark. Several years later, the landlord retires and decides to sell the property to a new landlord. The new landlord takes out a mortgage to purchase their asset, and it is now the role of the renter to toil away to pay this off for them. On and on this merry-go-round will go until housing is taken out of the hands of commercial landlords. To conclude, landlords don't rent houses for charity. They do it because they can charge more than the cost of maintenance, and people who don't own land or housing will pay whatever the asking price is because it's better to get ripped off in a rental than to be homeless and live under a bridge. It's in fact the exact opposite of generosity and philanthropy. But landlords risk, so therefore they deserve profit. Do they really, though? Real estate is arguably one of the most secure investments one can make, and even if no one wants to rent or the value of the property goes down, the landlord still has an asset that he can sell for a massive cash injection directly into his pocket. Not exactly a bad deal. Also, risk is a stupid argument. Human traffickers and drug dealers also risk quite a bit. To argue that they deserve whatever because they've risked is stupidity, and likewise for landlords or anyone else who risks. But those are illegal examples, there's no way you can compare. Except, yeah, I can. Get that critical thinking going a bit. If state-determined legality was the only thing that makes some risk acceptable or even laudable, while other risks something to condemn, what really is the material difference there? This is not equating landlordism with drug trafficking, mind you. This is just a criticism of the concept of risk. Also, how one risks property they've inherited, or a massive corporation with thousands of properties risks their investment, is beyond me. This also kind of ties into another point in that most people do some kind of labor. They actively work in order to earn their keep. This labor plays a positive role in the development of society, and if said workers disappear, there would be a noticeable change. Not so for landlords, though. All they do is own, and if they cease to exist, well, you'd scarcely notice. But they maintain / cut the grass / blah blah. Yeah, we'll get to that. Arguably, though, the only risk taken is by society in keeping landlords, and of course the tenants that risk being kicked out onto the street. But rental contracts are voluntary. This argument is ridiculous because fundamentally rental contracts are done under duress. When your options are either being homeless or pay whatever a landlord demands, including sexual favors during the latest COVID happenings, then you can't exactly honestly claim that's a fully voluntary agreement taking place, now can you? This, of course, doesn't touch on other factors that are completely involuntary yet perpetuate social inequality, especially along racial lines, be it in settler colonial or formerly colonial nations. In the US, double the amount of black households rent, 58%, as compared to white households, 28%. What this means is that rather than saving for their own property, African Americans disproportionately contribute nearly half their income every month to rental payments, further forcing them into a system predicated on keeping them impoverished. The solution here isn't more black landlords, but the socialization of homes so that no one is homeless, no one is forced to rent, and no one owns vast tracts of land and property, further deepening the divide in an already divided nation. But landlords have to do managerial and servicing work on their properties. Let's quote a landlord I found lamenting how much work he has to do. Speaking as a landlord, I say no. I take all the risk. I provide decent living accommodations for a tenant where he knows the rent and all the costs in advance. And if something breaks, I have to fix it at my expense. I have to cut down the grass, maintain the building, obey all the laws regarding lead paint and smoke detectors. I am not allowed to discriminate against what kind of tenant I can take. I am even forced, by law, to make reasonable accommodations for the handicapped. I cannot even go into the apartment without the permission of the tenant unless there's an emergency. So, you're not allowed to be racist. You have to make sure a handicapped tenant can actually get into the property. You have to make sure that there aren't toxic chemicals in the walls, and you can't blatantly violate the privacy of your tenants whenever you want. Oh, poor you. Here, have a tax incentive. Jesus Christ. Firstly, most landlords do not build the houses themselves. Developers hire workers to do it. Most landlords don't do the maintenance themselves. They hire people to do it for them, if they even bother, which, if you've ever rented, you'd be acutely aware of the quality of the landlord paint job phenomenon. Most landlords don't do the gardening. They hire gardeners to do it, if at all. And the cherry on top is that they're paying these people with money that comes from your pocket, your rent, and still skimming some from the top as profit. Hell, even if the landlord has a mortgage on the property, it's not them paying the fees for that mortgage, it's all coming out of the rent you pay. A garbage article from Investopedia, Jesus Christ, has some garbage article titled 7 Homeowner Costs Renters Don't Pay, of which all listed things aside from the original purchase of the property are paid from the rent the tenant pays, if the home was even purchased outright in the first place rather than on mortgage that, again, you pay. I have my own bills to pay. How am I supposed to put food on the table without being a landlord? To quote the same source I cited earlier, given the traditional landlord battle cry of, I've got my own bills to pay too, don't you know? Readers may be surprised to learn that nearly half of landlords own their renters' homes outright, meaning without a mortgage. For these landlords, the ongoing cost of supplying a property to a renter is limited to the costs incurred in keeping the property in a good state of repair and fit for human habitation. In comparison to average rents, these costs are negligible. According to research by the insurer More Than, the national average expenditure necessary on a 3-bedroom home for repair work, maintenance, and building insurance is only £73.17 per month. In comparison, the average rent on a 3-bedroom home in Manchester in 2018 was £895 per month, more than 10 times the average ongoing cost to the mortgage-free landlord in supplying the property. To put it another way, such a landlord's yearly costs would be covered by payment on their first month's rent, with change to spare, with every payment thereafter being pure profit. Also, get a job? Dip into that rainy day fund. Cut down on the avocado toast, perhaps. No wonder they bitch about risk so much. Apparently a single expense can ruin them. They do well to be more fiscally responsible. Laws are in favor of tenants. We landlords have no power. This is a point so laughable that I barely need to go over it. In the UK, 1 in 5 ministers of parliament are landlords, as compared to 2% of the general public. In the US, at least 238 federal lawmakers are also landlords. More than 200 senior congressional staffers also own properties and land they rent across the US. Furthermore, there is no limit under current law on how much they can rake in as landlords, a neat little exploit to get out of the income limit they're supposed to have beside their federal salary. An interesting article on the topic is, here's how many landlords are in the Washington legislature, which I suggest you read. In 2016 in the UK, a blatant example of landlord influence saw 72 private landlord MPs contributing to defeating a Labour bill which, as a clause, would have required private landlords to make homes fit for human habitation. This was shot down. But yes, dear landlord, you're oppressed because of some loose legal protection preventing you from immediately evicting the single mother working minimum wage with 2 kids. That's the issue here. But some people prefer renting. Yeah, fuck off, no one prefers renting. The absolute smallest minority of people that have to move around a lot might prefer the convenience of renting, sure, but that doesn't justify private ownership of hundreds of properties for single individuals or the entire system of landlordism. If people need to move around a lot for work and require housing, then rotating housing plans for such industries is something the state can and should do, rather than, well, landlords. Furthermore, for the vast majority of people who live and work in one place and don't need to move around a lot, the clear preference is ownership. Also, those that attempt to paint renting versus owning as some quirky choice people make seem to forget that going from renting to owning isn't easy. In many areas across the US, and the rest of the world for that matter, landlords are buying up every house that hits the market and converting them to rentals or Airbnbs. This is especially so in third world capitals with heavy tourist presence. The people who actually live there can't actually afford to live there. In the US, a common sight is seeing cash offers with nearly $100,000 over asking price for property that just dropped onto the market. Not from that cute couple with 2.3 kids, but from some conglomerate or investment firm buying up to rent. This is not a sane way to organize housing. Through my hard work, I got this property, so I deserve this property as an investment. This is the only argument that can at least be somewhat defended. I mentioned this in the first video I made on topic, but I don't have an issue with your grandparents that have a single property they rent out to help with their retirement. My issue is with corporate renting, in which dozens, hundreds, and even thousands of housing units are owned by a single individual or a company. The problem is systemic, and that's why the issue isn't for you to aspire to be a landlord as the only solution, but to abolish the concept of landlordism entirely. If you're a working couple who actually contribute to society and have one rental property on the side, hey, capitalism is brutal and you can't be faulted for trying to secure your livelihood. The issue is, though, that the system not only necessitates this behavior, but actively encourages hoarding and inhumane business practices. You yourself are not at fault, in my opinion. Those that own 300 apartments, though, those deserve the Mount treatment. Abolish landlordism, dismantle capitalism, and begin the construction of socialism. I made several videos on this that you can refer to here. And that's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too. Philip Novak, Matthew Foy, David Moreau, Ross Natfeld, My Biggest Fan, Neil, Thomas, Guillaume Legault, Jay, Mariar Keshavars, Ashley, Fiona Punke, Ellent, BJ Dripley, Professor G, Katie Marshall, Gail Whitetail, and Razi. Thanks for watching.